What is the strangest place you could be in the middle of the icy North Atlantic? How about a sweltering 100-degree Turkish bath, surrounded by intricate blue tiles and breathing in hot, dry air? Or perhaps a gymnasium, sitting astride a machine that mimics the jarring buck of an electric camel. The Titanic's first class was not just luxury. It was a bizarre, hermetically sealed bubble. It was a waking dream, a floating piece of the wealthiest parts of London or New York, set adrift in the cold, dark sea. And in just a few short days, that bubble was about to burst. We imagine this luxury as a static portrait, a collection of photographs frozen in time by the tragedy to come. We see the still images of the grand staircase or the opulent dining room, but for those aboard, this was not a still life. It was a journey. It was a 4-day drift, a slow and steady separation from reality, one day at a time. Tonight, we're not just going to look at the Titanic. We're going to board it. We will check our trunks at the dock, walk the long gangway, and feel the solid, reassuring rhythm of its massive engines. We will settle into the surreal calm of its daily life and understand what it felt like to be inside this bubble of perceived invincibility. If you are settling in for the night, perhaps getting comfortable and ready for rest, I am so glad to have you here. I always love seeing where in the world our stories are heard and what time it might be for you. Where are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments below. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe. This is a place for calming history stories designed to help you unwind, relax, and gently fall asleep. Tonight, in our bedtime history, we experience the strange and opulent reality of life in Titanic's first class. Our journey begins not at sea, but at the dock. The air is electric with anticipation. The date is April 10th, 1912. The place is Southampton, England. This was not just another ship. This was the ship of dreams. To stand on the dockside that morning was to be humbled. The Titanic, looming over the pier, did not look like a ship at all. It looked, as many later said, like a cliff face, a towering black wall of steel, riveted and solid. It seemed more like a piece of the city, a building that had somehow been moved to the water's edge. Its 4 massive funnels, painted in the distinctive buff color of the White Star Line, stood tall against the crisp April sky. They were a declaration of power. This ship was a statement. It was a symbol of national pride, of industrial might. It was the largest moving object ever built by the hands of man. This was the pinnacle of the Gilded Age, an era that believed, truly, that technology and wealth had conquered the old fears of nature. And this was the place to be. The docks were a chaotic, strangely organized mix of sights and sounds. You could hear the rumble of countless luggage carts, their wheels clattering over the cobblestones, piled high with trunks that looked more like small pieces of furniture. You could hear the sharp, occasional blast of the ship's whistles, a deep sound that vibrated in your chest, and you could hear the murmurs of the crowd, a mix of refined English and brash American accents, the who's who of high society gathering for this maiden voyage. They were all here. They checked their trunks, they tipped the porters in their flat caps, and they sized each other up. This was the RMS Titanic, the second of the Olympic-class liners. Her older sister, the Olympic, was already a success. Her younger sister, the Britannic, was still being built. They were the masterpieces of the Belfast shipyard, Harland and Wolff, created for the British shipping company, the White Star Line. The competition, at the time, was fierce. The rival Cunard Line had two famous ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, and they were fast. They were the greyhounds of the Atlantic, known for their speed. The White Star Line and its chairman, J. Bruce Ismay, knew they could not compete on speed alone. So they made a different choice. They would build ships that were not the fastest, but were, by a huge margin, the largest, the most stable, and the most luxurious the world had ever seen. This entire enterprise was financed by the American tycoon J.P. Morgan and his massive conglomerate, the International Mercantile Marine, or IMM. This was a ship built by British hands, but funded by American money, a true symbol of the age. The port of Southampton itself had been forced to change. The city had built an entirely new dock, the White Star Dock, later known as the Ocean Dock, specifically to accommodate the immense size of these new liners. Trains pulled right up to the ship's side, delivering passengers from London directly to the gangway, and the passengers came. They came with their families, their servants, their pets, and their mountains of luggage. The cost to be here was staggering. A first-class parlor suite, the best on the ship, cost over £870. In today's money, that is the equivalent of over $110,000 for a one-way ticket. This price was a barrier. It was an advertisement. It ensured that the people you met in the lounges and at dinner were of the right sort. By contrast, a ticket in third class, down in the bowels of the ship, cost about £7. That is, around $900 today. For the wealthy in first class, £870 was an easy expense. For the immigrants in third, £7 was often their entire life savings. At the top of the gangway, greeting his passengers, was Captain Edward J. Smith. He was the White Star Line's most senior and respected captain, with his impressive white beard and gentle, fatherly demeanor. He was known as the millionaire's captain. He was the one the wealthiest passengers trusted and requested. This voyage, the maiden voyage of the greatest ship in the world, was to be his final journey, a crowning achievement before his planned retirement. Also on board, overseeing his creation, was J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman himself. He was there to see his grand experiment in luxury pay off, to bask in the glory of its first crossing. And so they boarded. The famous and the fabulously wealthy Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, perhaps the richest man on board, with his new, young, and very pregnant wife, Madeline. He was an Astor. His very name was synonymous with New York wealth. There was Benjamin Guggenheim, the heir to a vast mining fortune, traveling with his mistress, and Isidore and Ida Strauss, the owners of the famous Macy's department store in New York, returning from a winter in Europe. They were a devoted couple, known for their quiet dignity. The air smelled of coal, smoke, and salt, a sharp industrial temps that mingled with the expensive perfumes of the ladies and the rich leather of the new luggage. The crisp April breeze whipped at the flags. The crowds on the shore waved their handkerchiefs. The gangways were pulled away. With a deep, powerful shudder that vibrated through the very cobblestones of the dock, the giant began to move. But its journey, this grand, triumphant departure, almost ended right there in the harbor. The Titanic was so large, its movement so powerful, that it created its own physics. As it began to move down the narrow channel of the River Test, it pushed a colossal amount of water ahead of it, and pulled an equally massive amount in its wake. Moored nearby were two other liners, the SS New York, of the American Line, and the Oceanic, another White Star ship. They sat quietly, tied to the dock as the Titanic slid past. But the laws of hydrodynamics, what we now call vessel interaction or suction, were about to make themselves known. The immense displacement of water from the Titanic's passage created a powerful, irresistible vacuum. The water level dropped suddenly, and the SS New York, a much smaller ship, was pulled violently toward the passing giant. There was a sound like gunfire, a series of sharp, terrifying cracks that echoed across the water. The New York's thick mooring ropes, designed to hold it fast against any tide, snapped one by one under the enormous strain. They whipped through the air like lethal bullwhips. A collective gasp, then shouts, rose from the docks. The stern of the New York, now free, began swinging out, its metal hull moving helplessly directly toward the Titanic's port side. On the bridge of the Titanic, Captain Smith, in his first few minutes of command, was facing his first crisis. He immediately barked an order: full astern, port. This was a masterful command. He ordered the port engines, the ones closest to the New York, to be thrown into full reverse. He was not just trying to stop the ship. He was trying to use the powerful propeller wash, the churning water from the reversed propellers, to create a cushion. He was trying to physically push the other ship away with a torrent of water. At the same time, a small, unassuming tugboat, the Vulcan, saw the unfolding disaster. It steamed heroically into the gap, its own engines straining, its crew scrambling to get a line on the New York's bow. The Vulcan's stack billowed acrid black smoke as it pulled with all its might, trying to tow the drifting liner out of the path of destruction. For a few agonizingly long seconds, the gap between the two massive ships closed. Passengers on the Titanic's promenade deck, who had been waving goodbye, now watched in stunned silence. The gap closed and closed. Then, the Titanic's propeller wash took hold. The Vulcan's line went taut. The New York's drift slowed, and it stopped. It is estimated that the two hulls missed each other by only 4 feet, the width of a small table. The incident caused a significant delay. The Titanic had to stop its engines, wait for the New York to be secured, and then carefully restart its journey. The entire departure was delayed by over an hour. But what is most fascinating is how this event was interpreted. For those on board, this was not a dark omen. It was not a sign of bad luck. In fact, it was the opposite. For the first-class passengers watching from their decks, it was a demonstration of the Titanic's incredible power. They had just seen their ship, so mighty, nearly pull another ship from its moorings just by passing it, and they had seen their captain, the famous millionaire's captain, handle the crisis with calm, instantaneous skill. His engines were so powerful they could push another liner away. The near miss did not frighten them. It reinforced their sense of security. It proved, on day one, that this ship was special, that it was powerful, that it was, perhaps, invincible. With the disaster averted, the Titanic finally left the harbor, passing the Isle of Wight and heading for its first stop in Cherbourg, France, to pick up more passengers. For those in first class, the drama of the port was over. It was time to settle in. It was time to explore their new home. And what a home it was. It was, in every sense, a floating palace. As the shores of England faded into a gray mist, the passengers began to explore, and what they found was breathtaking. The scale was almost impossible to comprehend. The heart of the ship, its showpiece, was the grand staircase. It descended 5 full decks, a cascade of rich, polished oak, gleaming under the light of a massive wrought iron and glass dome. The dome flooded the space with natural light during the day. At night, a huge crystal chandelier provided the glow. On the main landing of this staircase was a large, ornate carving. It was a clock, flanked by two figures, titled Honor and Glory, Crowning Time. It was a fitting, confident centerpiece for a ship that believed it had mastered both. To navigate this vast space, passengers did not even need to use the stairs. The Titanic was equipped with 3 electric elevators, a true novelty for the time, available only to first class. They were small, plush, carpeted rooms, run by uniformed attendants, that would whisk you from the boat deck down to the reception rooms. And what a reception! On D-deck, at the bottom of the grand stairs, passengers would enter the reception room. It was a 5,000-square-foot lounge, decorated in a grand Jacobean style, with white-painted columns and cozy alcoves. Fresh-cut flowers were everywhere. The ship's string quartet, led by Wallace Hartley, would often play here in the afternoon, their gentle music a backdrop to quiet conversation. This room was the grand entrance to the first-class dining saloon. Entering this room for the first time must have been an experience. It was the largest room afloat, spanning the full width of the ship. It was so well engineered that, unlike other ships, it needed no columns to support the ceiling, giving it an incredible sense of open space. It could seat over 550 passengers at once, at small, intimate tables. The room was paneled in white, with leaded glass windows and rich red and gold carpets. It was a room designed for long, multi-course dinners, for seeing and being seen. But, for some, even this grand saloon was not exclusive enough. For those passengers, there was the à la carte restaurant. This was a smaller, more intimate French restaurant, run by the famed London restaurateur Luigi Gatti. Passengers paid extra to dine here. It was quieter, the food was even more elaborate, and it was a way to signal an even higher level of status. After dinner, it was time to retire. The cabins in first class were not cabins, they were staterooms, they were apartments. The most opulent were the millionaire's suites, located on B-deck. These were 2 massive suites, B-52, 54, and 56. One was occupied by J. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line chairman. The other was booked by Mrs. Charlotte Cardezza, a wealthy American heiress. These suites were more like small houses. They had multiple bedrooms, dressing rooms, private bathrooms, and a large, private sitting room. But their most incredible feature was a 50-foot-long private promenade deck, a private outdoor space shielded from the wind, where one could sit on a lounge chair and watch the ocean, entirely separate from the other passengers. Even the standard first-class cabins were astonishing. They were decorated in a variety of period styles. You could request a room in Louis XVI, or Georgian, or Regency. Many had their own private, attached bathrooms, with hot and cold running water. This was an exceptional luxury, even in the best hotels on land, let alone on a ship. And, of course, there was the staff. Stewards and stewardesses were available 24 hours a day, summoned by electric call bells in each room. They would unpack your trunks, draw your bath, press your clothes, and bring you anything you needed. Walking through these spaces, you would feel the plush, deep pile carpets under your feet. You would run your hand along the smooth, carved oak of the staircase banister. You would smell the beeswax and would polish the faint, pleasant scent of fine tobacco and the constant, subtle aroma of fresh flowers. It simply did not feel like a ship. It felt like the lobby of the finest hotel in London, or new, for the passengers exploring on that first afternoon. The sensation was one of total security. The ship was a palace, but it was also sold as a health resort, a place to rest and recuperate on the long journey. And as the first full day at sea began, passengers began to explore the ship's most bizarre and modern features. Its state-of-the-art fitness center. The gymnasium was located on the starboard side of the boat deck, right up top. This was a brilliant design choice. It was a bright, airy room, painted in white, with large windows that overlooked the sea. Passengers could exercise while watching the vast, empty expanse of the North Atlantic slide by. The gym was open for ladies from 10 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon. It was open for gentlemen from 2 in the afternoon until 6. Children were allowed in, under supervision, at other times. Presiding over this modern marvel was the ship's physical educator, Mr. Thomas Macaulay. He was there to greet passengers in his white flannel trousers and to demonstrate the very latest in fitness technology. And that technology was ... strange. The stars of the gym were the electric camel and the electric horse. The electric horse was a mechanical saddle that, with the flip of a switch, simulated the motions of a horse's trot and gallop. It was designed to give one a proper ride without the trouble of an actual horse. But stranger still was the electric camel. This was another mechanical saddle, but it was designed to simulate the specific rolling and jarring motion of a real camel. This was not just for fun. It was advertised as a health benefit, particularly good for stimulating the liver. Imagine the sight. A woman in a long white dress and a fashionable hat, sitting politely astride a worry vibrating machine that bucked and rolled, all while she looked out the window at the cold, gray ocean. The gym also featured more familiar equipment. There were mechanical rowing machines, perfect for practicing one's sculling. There were stationary bicycles. There were punching bags for the gentlemen and Indian clubs, a popular form of light weightlifting. But the sporting facilities did not end there. For the truly energetic, there was the squash rackets court. This was located much lower down in the ship, on F deck. It was a full-sized 2-story court. Passengers could book it for 50 cents, about $15 today, for half an hour of play. And if you did not have a partner, that was no problem. The court came with its own professional, Mr. Frederick Wright. He would happily play a game with you, or give you lessons, for a small extra fee. The rhythmic thwack of the squash ball, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes, echoed deep inside the hull of the ship. For those who preferred a more gentle form of exercise, there was the promenade deck. This was a vast open-air space that wrapped around the ship. Passengers would spend hours here, walking, socializing, or just relaxing in rented deck chairs. Yes, even the deck chairs were an extra charge. You would rent one for the duration of the voyage, and a steward would make sure it was always in your preferred spot, ready for you with a thick blanket. This was the daily routine. A morning of bizarre mechanical exercise. An afternoon of brisk walks in the cold, salt air. The feel of the vibrating saddle of the camel. The faint smell of liniment and sweat in the gym, quickly overpowered by the clean, cold wind from the sea. This was the sheer absurdity of the bubble. The need to ride a mechanical animal to stay fit, while the most powerful engines in the world, deep below your feet, propelled you effortlessly across the ocean. The outside world, the real, dangerous ocean, was just a view. It was scenery. After a morning of bizarre exercise and brisk walks on deck, the social rituals of the afternoon and evening would begin. This floating world, this hermetically sealed bubble of Gilded Age confidence, had its own rhythm, it had its own rules, and for these first few days, it had its own unshakable, profound, and deeply held sense of confidence. They were settling in. The ship felt invincible. The world outside was a distant rumor. What do you think is the most surprisingly modern or bizarre luxury they had on board? Let me know as we continue our journey. That sense of confidence, of unshakable security, had taken root. After the brief drama of the near miss in Southampton, the Titanic had settled into its powerful transatlantic stride. The bubble was now fully formed. By the second and third day at sea, life on board had developed its own powerful rhythm. It was a waking dream. The passengers were no longer in England, and not yet in America. They were in a self-contained universe, a floating kingdom with its own rules, its own rituals, and its own strict social codes. Life in first class was, above all, a performance, and this performance had begun before anyone had even set foot on the ship. Many of the wealthiest passengers had arrived in Southampton on the Millionaire's Special. This was a private boat train, run from London Waterloo, exclusively for Titanic's first-class passengers. It was a way to travel from the city to the dock without having to mix with the general public. The bubble of exclusion began on land, and now, at sea, the performance was in full swing. The key social stage was the vast, open promenade deck. This was where passengers would take their laps. They would walk for exercise, of course, breathing in the cold, clean salt air. But more importantly, they walked for social visibility. This was a parade of wealth and status. Gentlemen in their tweed coats and flat caps, ladies in their expensive furs and fashionable hats, bracing against the wind. You would stroll the deck, perhaps nodding to your acquaintances, and just as importantly, deciding who not to acknowledge. And all of this was set to music. The ship's orchestra, led by the beloved Wallace Hartley, provided a constant, genteel soundtrack. They were not just one band. They were a string quartet and a small quintet. They played in various locations throughout the day. In the morning, they might be in the reception room. In the afternoon, they would move to the palm court. Their music, a light classical or a popular ragtime tune, drifted on the air. It was a constant, calming reminder of civility, of order. It was another layer of insulation against the vast, empty wilderness of the ocean outside. Within this bubble, there were complex social divides. The passenger list had been published in newspapers before the voyage. Everyone knew exactly who was on board, and everyone knew where they fit. There was a clear divide between the old, established British aristocracy and the new, brash American industrial tycoons, the Astors, the Guggenheims, the Whittingers. They were fabulously wealthy, but they were new money to the European eyes. And then there were passengers like Margaret Brown. We know her today as the unsinkable Molly Brown. But in 1912, she was simply Mrs. J.J. Brown, a new money passenger from Denver, Colorado. Her husband had struck it rich in mining. Margaret was boisterous. She was cheerful. She was to the ears of the old money matrons, loud and unrefined. She was famously looked down upon by the circles that included John, Jacob, and Madeline Astor. She represented the changing world, a world where new wealth was crashing the gates of the old. Gossip and social climbing were primary activities. The lounges, particularly during the day, were dominated by the ladies. They would sit, write letters, and quietly, carefully observe. Every conversation was a calculation. Every invitation to tea was a social victory. And what about the gentlemen? After the long, formal, multi-course dinners, the sexes would often separate, just as they did in the great houses on land. The ladies might retire to the reading and writing room, or to the lounge for cordials and quiet conversation. The gentlemen, however, would retreat to their own exclusive sanctuary. This was the first-class smoking room. This room was an exclusively male domain. It was designed to feel like the finest private club in London. The style was heavy Georgian. The walls were paneled in rich, dark mahogany, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. The large, stained-glass windows were lit from behind, glowing with color, even in the dead of night. And, in the center of the room, a true symbol of this ship's defiant luxury, a real, working fireplace with a carved mantel. It burned real, glowing coals. Think about that for a moment. A working fireplace in a room made of wood in the middle of a steel ship on the North Atlantic. It was the peak of engineered confidence. Here, the air was thick. It smelled of strong cigar smoke and fine brandy. This was the inner sanctum. This was the boardroom of the Atlantic. Men would gather around the small tables, their faces lit by the low, green-shaded lamps. The main pastime here was cards. Bridge and poker were the games of choice, and they were often played for incredibly high stakes. Men were winning and losing small fortunes, all while the ship's engines thrummed reassuringly beneath their feet. This was their world, a floating, masculine drawing room where every comfort of home had been not just replicated, but perfected. While the men navigated this complex social and business world in the smoke-filled room, the ship catered to every other possible indulgence. It created spaces that felt like they had been plucked whole from the finest European capitals. The goal, it seemed, was to make you forget you were at sea at all. This was most true in the new, fashionable Café Parisien. This was a new feature for the White Star Line, an annex attached to the exclusive à la carte restaurant. It was designed to look and feel exactly like a sidewalk café in Paris. The walls were covered in white trellis work, with real climbing ivy and other plants woven through it. The furniture was light, delicate wicker, and the entire curved outer wall was made of floor-to-ceiling windows, giving a spectacular, uninterrupted view of the ocean. Here, you could sit at a small, intimate table, order the finest French cuisine, and feel as though you were in the heart of France. The ocean outside the window did not feel like a real, cold, dangerous place. It felt like a painted backdrop, a beautiful, moving painting. Adjoining this area were two other remarkable rooms, the veranda and the palm court. These were also light, airy spaces designed for relaxation, for afternoon tea, and for quiet conversation. They were, essentially, a massive conservatory at sea. They were filled with live palm trees, potted ferns, and more climbing ivy. The air in here was different. It was warmer, slightly humid from the plants. It was a stark, delightful contrast to the brisk, cold, salt air just outside on the deck. You could recline on a wicker lounge chair. A steward would bring you tea, and you could listen to the ship's orchestra play another gentle set. It was an oasis of green, a garden in the middle of the sea. And for those seeking true quiet, there was the reading and writing room. This was, by unspoken rule, primarily a space for the ladies. It was the counterpart to the men's smoking room. But where the smoking room was dark, heavy, and loud, this room was the opposite. It was decorated in a light, elegant Georgian style, The walls were white. The furniture was covered in plush, light-colored fabrics. It had its own large fireplace and deep, comfortable chairs. It was a place of profound quiet, broken only by the rustle of a newspaper or the scratch of a pen on paper. And what were they reading? They were not, in fact, cut off from the world. The ship had its own onboard newspaper. It was called the Atlantic Daily Bulletin. This was not a pre-printed paper. It was created every single day, right there on the ship. The ship's wireless operators, high up in the Marconi room, would receive the latest news from all over the world. They would get stock prices from New York, political news from London, and of course, the latest society gossip. This information was taken to a small print shop on board, where it was typeset and printed. Every morning, a fresh copy of the Atlantic Daily Bulletin was available for first-class passengers. They were in their own perfect bubble. But the world was still delivered to them, curated for their convenience. They could sit in the palm court, surrounded by trees, reading the day's stock prices, all while gliding silently across the ocean. The detachment was total. This sense of detachment from the ocean, this elaborate waking dream, was made even more profound by the ship's most incredible and most bizarre features. These were the Turkish baths and the heated swimming pool. To visit them, you had to take an elevator down. Deep inside the ship, on F deck, you would find the entrance. This complex was for first-class passengers only. A ticket cost $1 for admission. That is about $30 in today's money. This was not just a steam room. This was a full Victorian-style Turkish bath. A series of rooms, each with a different temperature and purpose, designed for a long, luxurious, and healthy ritual. You would first enter the temperate room. This was a place to acclimate, to relax on a lounge chair before the heat. From there, you would move to the hot room. The temperature in here was kept at over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It was an intense, oppressive, dry heat. After you had spent as much time as you could stand, you would move to the steam room. Here, the air was the opposite. It was heavy, damp, and filled with steam, sometimes scented with eucalyptus. You could hear the constant, gentle hiss of the steam jets. Then, perhaps, you would visit the shampooing room for a scrub, or take a plunge into a small, cold pool. But the most impressive part of the entire complex was the cooling room. This was where you went after the heat. It was designed to look like a set from the Arabian Nights. It was a fantasy, a sultan's palace, hidden in the belly of a steel giant. The walls were covered in intricate, blue and green Moorish-style tiles. There were gilded columns, carved teak furniture, and plush loungers. Attendants would bring you cool drinks, or perhaps a snack. You would lie there, wrapped in a warm towel, the light low, the air quiet and still. You were in a desert oasis, but you were on a ship. And right next door to this complex was another modern marvel, the heated swimming bath. We would call it a swimming pool. It was one of the very first ever installed on a passenger ship. It was not large, perhaps 30 feet long and 14 feet wide, but it was filled with heated seawater. You could hear the sounds of splashing, the quiet murmurs of conversation echoing off the tiled walls. Now, think about the reality of this. A passenger on EFDAC is complaining that the 100-degree hot room is perhaps a little too warm. Or maybe they are dipping a toe into the heated swimming pool, enjoying its artificial warmth. Just on the other side of that steel hull, just a few inches of metal away from them, was the North Atlantic. By the third day of the voyage, the water temperature outside had dropped to near freezing. It was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, that is -2 degrees Celsius. A passenger was sweating in artificial tropical heat, while the real world, the deadly cold, was held back by nothing more than a thin wall of steel and the unshakable confidence of the Gilded Age. It was the ultimate insulation, the peak of the illusion. It was a total, defiant rejection of the outside world. While the passengers enjoyed these dreamlike luxuries, the true marvel of the Titanic was working tirelessly and almost silently beneath their feet. It was the source of the heat for the Turkish baths, the light for the reading room, and the power that moved this floating city. It was the ship's engines. For the first-class passengers, the engines were not a noise. They were a feeling. They were a constant, low-frequency thrum, a subtle, powerful vibration that you felt more in the soles of your feet than you heard with your ears. You would feel it when you stood on the promenade deck. You would feel it through your pillow as you lay in bed at night. You might see it as a tiny, barely perceptible ripple in your teacup. This was the heartbeat of their world. And this feeling was, itself, a key luxury feature. The ship was propelled by a hybrid system. It had two massive, traditional, four-cylinder, reciprocating steam engines. These drove the two outer propellers. These were the thumpers. But it also had a third, more modern engine, a low-pressure Parsons turbine, which drove the central propeller. This hybrid system was a stroke of genius. It was incredibly efficient, but just as importantly, it produced far less vibration than the Alterbin systems used on the rival Cunard ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. Those ships were faster, but they shook. The Titanic was built for solid, stable, smooth comfort, and the source of this power was immense. Deep in the ship's bowels were 29 boilers. These were fed by 159 furnaces. To feed these furnaces, the ship consumed over 600 tons of coal every single day. This coal was shoveled by hand by a black gang of 176 firemen. These men worked in grueling 4-hour shifts, in intense heat, in a dusty, noisy hell. They were the hidden engine of the dream world, toiling in the dark, so that the passengers above could enjoy the light. The symbol of this power, visible to the whole world, was the ships for massive funnels. They were a declaration of power. But, in a final act of Gilded Age illusion, the fourth funnel, the one closest to the stern, was a dummy. It was not needed for smoke. It was used for ventilation. It was an exhaust for the kitchens and for the great turbine room. But mostly, it was there for aesthetics. It made the ship look more majestic, more powerful, more symmetrical. By Saturday, April 13th, the third day at sea, the ship was running at its top speed. It was making around 21 or 22 knots, gliding through a calm, flat sea. This constant, powerful, and incredibly smooth motion gave the passengers a profound, almost primal sense of security. The ship did not feel like it was rocking on the water. It felt like it was paving it. It felt like the ocean was moving out of its way. That steady, reliable pulse, that reassuring thrum, was the ship's heartbeat, and it sent a clear, hypnotic message. All is well. I am in control. I am powerful. I am invincible. Day after day, this heartbeat lulled them into a deeper and deeper dream of security. By the evening of Sunday, April 14th, the dream was at its absolute peak. The sea was calm, the air was cold, and the ship was gliding effortlessly and at full speed toward its fate. They were completely sealed off from the world. If you were there, which of these dreamlike places would you have spent your time in? The palm court, the smoking room, or the bizarre Turkish baths? Let me know. Sunday, April 14th. This was the day the dream would end. But it began with a strange and deceptive beauty. The ship continued its push westward, slicing through an ocean that had become eerily calm. Survivors would later struggle to describe it. It was a sea of glass. It was like an oil slick. It was a polished, dark mirror reflecting a sky thick with stars, but no moon. This profound stillness was, in itself, a danger. On a normal night, the ocean's own movement would send waves crashing against the base of an iceberg. This would create a line of white, visible foam, a telltale warning. But on this flat, silent sea, there was nothing. An iceberg would be nothing more than a shadow, a piece of the dark, until it was too late. And as the sun set, the temperature dropped. It dropped rapidly. The air on the outer decks became sharp, biting, and intensely cold. It was a dry, frigid air that hinted at the vast fields of ice lying unseen in the darkness ahead. But inside, the illusion of a floating summer palace was perfectly maintained. Inside was warmth. Inside was light. Inside, the first-class passengers were preparing for their final, opulent dinner. The 10-course meal was the very peak of the ship's luxury. It was a feast that began with chilled oysters. It moved through savory soups and delicate fish. It presented dishes like filet mignon, lily, and rich pâté de foie gras. It concluded with Waldorf pudding, fresh fruit, and cheeses. The crystal glasses clinked. The silver shone under the light of the electric chandeliers. The orchestra played light, cheerful tunes, and Captain Smith himself was not on the bridge scanning the horizon. He was a guest of honor. He was attending a lavish dinner party held for him in the exclusive a la carte restaurant. He was, like his passengers, enjoying the pinnacle of the voyage. While this world of warmth and indulgence floated on, another world was buzzing. In the wireless room, the Marconi operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were busy. They were not, in fact, employed by the White Star Line. They were employees of the Marconi Company. Their primary job was not to listen for warnings. It was to send the passengers messages. The backlog was enormous. They were sending stock tips, travel plans, and friendly greetings to shore. And all day, the warnings had been coming in. The ship Coronia had sent one. The Baltic had sent another. Then, a critical message came from a ship called the Mesaba. It detailed a large field of pack ice and great icebergs. It was directly in the Titanic's path. That message was received by Jack Phillips, but it was just one more piece of paper. It was set aside. It never reached the bridge. The operators were tired. The equipment was loud. They were focused on their commercial traffic. The system was not built for safety. Not really. It was built for convenience. As the night grew deeper and the temperature outside plunged toward freezing, the final warning came. It was from a nearby ship, the Californian. Its wireless operator, Cyril Evans, sent a message. He reported that his ship was stopped. It was, he warned, completely surrounded by ice. This was not a vague report. This was an immediate, urgent, and close-by danger. The message crackled into Jack Phillips's headphones. He was in the middle of transmitting passenger messages to the station at Cape Race. The signal from the Californian was loud. It was abrasive. Annoyed and overwhelmed with his own work, Phillips tapped out a curt reply. Shut up, I am busy." The operator on the Californian, hearing this, simply turned off his set and went to bed. The connection was broken. In first class, the grand dinner was ending. Passengers felt the ship to be a single, warm, bright jewel. It was gliding without effort through a vast, cold, and silent void. Some retired to the smoking room for a final brandy. Others listened to the orchestra play in the lounge. The hum of the engines was a constant, steady reassurance. It was the heartbeat of the ship. The final passengers were heading to their cabins. The lights in the public rooms were being dimmed one by one. The ship was preparing for sleep. And then, at 11:40 p.m., high above, in the freezing cold of the crow's nest, a lookout named Frederick Fleet strained his eyes against the dark. He saw something. It was 11:40 at night. The air was so cold, it stung the skin. In the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee scanned the endless black. They had no binoculars. The ship's binoculars were, in a simple twist of fate, locked in a cabinet. The key had been left ashore in Southampton. We will never know if that simple key would have changed the story. We can only wonder. Fleet stared. The sea was dark. The sky was dark. But this was different. A shape, a dark mass, as he later called it. It was darker than the dark, and it was dead ahead. He reached for the warning bell. He rang it 3 times. The sharp, clanging sound cut the cold air. At the same time, he grabbed the telephone. It connected him directly to the bridge. The phone was answered. Fleet shouted the most famous warning in maritime history. Iceberg, right ahead. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch was in command. He heard the call. He saw the shape for himself, now visible from the bridge. He reacted instantly. He barked an order to the helmsman, hardest starboard. This was an old sailing command. In 1912, it meant turn the ship's wheel all the way to the right, which would turn the ship's bow to the left, to port. At the same time, Murdoch rang the engine room telegraph. He signaled full astern. He was trying to stop the ship, or at least slow it down. The ship was a giant. It responded slowly. The bow began to turn, agonizingly. For a few terrible seconds, it seemed like it might be enough. The ship's port side was clearing the mass, but it was not fast enough. It was not a head-on collision. It was not the dramatic crash you might imagine. The ship's starboard side, the right side, grazed the iceberg. For many passengers, the sensation was subtle. It was a shudder, a slight, jarring, grinding feeling. One passenger compared it to a heavy wave washing over the ship. Another said it felt like rolling over 1,000 marbles. Many people, deep in their warm beds, slept right through it, but the damage was done. For decades, the world believed the iceberg had torn a single 300-foot gash in the hull. We now know this is unlikely. The truth is more subtle, and in many ways, more tragic. The immense pressure of the ancient ice did not rip the steel. Instead, it popped the rivets. The steel plates, held together by those rivets, buckled. They separated. Seams were opened all along the starboard side, and through those seams the freezing North Atlantic began to pour in. The ship was designed to be safe. It had 16 compartments, separated by watertight bulkheads. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, was on board. He had proudly stated that the ship could stay afloat if its first 4 compartments were breached. It was unthinkable that such a thing could happen. Captain Smith, woken by the shudder, was now on the bridge. He summoned Thomas Andrews. They needed to know what had happened. Andrews went below, into the belly of the beast. He did a quick, horrifying inspection. He saw the water swirling in the mailroom. He saw it rising in the forward cargo holds. He did the math. The water was not in 1 compartment, or 2, or even 4. The iceberg had opened up the first 6 of the ship's watertight compartments, and this revealed the fatal design flaw. The bulkheads, the watertight walls, were not truly watertight. They did not go all the way to the top deck. They only went up to E deck or D deck in the front of the ship. Thomas Andrews understood the implication immediately. He pictured it in his mind. It was like an ice cube tray. As the bow began to dip, the water in the 6th compartment would rise. It would rise until it was higher than the bulkhead, and then it would spill over the top. It would spill into the 7th compartment, and when the 7th compartment filled, it would spill into the 8th, and so on. It was a chain reaction. It was an unstoppable mathematical certainty. He returned to the bridge, his face pale. He found Captain Smith. He delivered the calm, horrifying prognosis. The great ship was doomed. The wound was mortal. When the captain asked him how long they had, Andrews gave his honest, terrible answer. "An hour," he said, "2 at most." The passengers, who had been woken by the grinding, or by the simple, strange feeling of a stumble, felt the ship go quiet. The impact itself was subtle. But what came next was the most terrifying and bizarre sensation of all. The engines stopped. The constant, reassuring thrum was gone. For 4 days, that vibration had been the sound of life. It was the sound of progress, of power, of the inevitable journey forward. It was a heartbeat, a steady pulse under their feet and in their pillows. Now there was nothing. Just a profound, unnatural silence. This silence was more alarming than the shudder. This is what woke most of the passengers. The deathly quiet, as many called it, was wrong. It felt like the ship had died. Confused, people began to emerge from their cabins. They put on heavy coats over their silk pajamas. They wrapped themselves in fur coats over their nightclothes. They wandered out onto the decks, into the freezing night air, to see what had happened. And what they saw was bizarre. The forward well deck, usually an empty, clean space, was now scattered with chunks of ice. The iceberg had shed pieces of itself as it scraped by. The passengers, still wrapped in the dream of invincibility, did not understand. They had no frame of reference for this. This was the unsinkable ship. So they reacted not with panic, but with curiosity. Some began to play with the ice. They kicked it around like snowballs. They picked up pieces as souvenirs. It was a strange, cold, and surreal party. But the ship was changing. Under their feet, a slight, almost imperceptible tilt had begun. A list to starboard. A noticeable dip at the bow. It felt awkward. On the bridge, the dream was over for Captain Smith. He knew the truth. He gave the orders. Uncover the lifeboats. Muster the passengers. Then he gave another order. He told the wireless operators to send a distress call, the CQD, the call for help, and he ordered the firing of the white distress rockets. One by one, they were sent up into the dark. They shot into the star-filled sky with a great whoosh, exploding with a sharp pop. They cast a brief, ghostly white light over the decks. These rockets were the universal signal of a ship in dire trouble. Not far away, perhaps only 10 or 20 miles, the crew of the Californian saw them. They were still stopped, surrounded by ice. They saw the white rockets exploding, one after another, from the massive, lit passenger ship in the distance. But their wireless operator was asleep, and their captain, Stanley Lord, having already been rebuffed, dismissed the signals. He thought they must be company signals. Perhaps they were just celebrating. He did nothing. Back on the Titanic, As passengers milled about in confusion, another sound started. Wallace Hartley, the ship's bandmaster, assembled his orchestra. They gathered in the first-class lounge, and they began to play. They played cheerful ragtime tunes. They played light, breezy waltzes. The music was meant to keep passengers calm, to prevent panic, to maintain the illusion of normalcy, even as the floor tilted beneath their feet. The scene was one of the strangest in history. Passengers in pajamas and fur coats, the sound of ice being kicked on the deck, the sharp smell of the iceberg itself, a cold mineral smell described by survivors, the pop of the rockets overhead, and the cheerful, tinny sound of the band playing on the dreamlike state continued. Passengers refused to believe the ship was sinking. They were in a heated, lit palace. The orchestra was playing. Why would they get into a tiny, open boat? Why would they leave this island of light to be lowered into the middle of the freezing, absolute darkness? The bubble of warmth and light was shrinking. The slow, dawning realization was spreading. The tilt of the deck was no longer subtle. It was obvious. Walking was becoming difficult. The order was given to load the lifeboats, and now the ship's final tragic flaw was revealed. The Titanic had 20 lifeboats. This was actually more than was legally required by the British Board of Trade at the time. The laws were old. They were based on a ship's weight, not its number of passengers. Those 20 boats could carry 1,178 people. There were over 2,200 people on board. There was only enough room for about half. The order was given, women and children first. But in the chaos and confusion, that simple order was interpreted in two different ways. On the starboard side, Officer William Murdoch was in charge. He interpreted the order as women and children first. After he had loaded all the women and children in the immediate area, he allowed men to board if there were still empty seats. He wanted to fill the boats. On the port side, Officer Charles Lightler was in charge. He was a stricter man. He interpreted the order as women and children only. He refused to let any men board, even when there were no more women waiting. He sent lifeboats away with dozens of empty seats. The loading was chaotic, but strangely calm. There was no widespread panic, not yet, only confusion and disbelief. Lifeboat number 1 became a symbol of the night's tragedy. It was an emergency cutter built to hold 40 people. It was launched with only 12. 7 of them were crew members. 5 were first-class passengers. It would later be known as the Millionaire's Boat. While this was happening, a terrible, deafening sound filled the air. The engineers, deep below, were venting steam from the funnels. It was a roar so loud that it drowned out orders. It added to the surreal, nightmarish quality of the scene. And in these final moments, the human stories, the true legends of the Titanic, were written. J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, the man who had pushed for the ship's size, stood by a collapsible lifeboat. As it was being lowered, he found himself with no one else around. He stepped into it. He survived. It was an act of self-preservation for which he would be vilified, branded a coward for the rest of his life. In contrast, Benjamin Guggenheim, the wealthy industrialist, knew his fate. He and his valet went back to their cabins. They changed out of their life jackets and sweaters. They put on their formal evening wear, their best suits. They were last seen in the grand staircase, sipping brandy. Guggenheim stated, "We've dressed in our best and are prepared to go down as gentlemen." Isidore and Ida Strauss, the elderly owners of Macy's department store, were offered seats in a lifeboat. Ida, however, refused to leave her husband. She would not be separated from him. An officer, seeing their age, offered Isidore a seat as well. He refused, saying he would not go before the other men. Ida made her choice. She gave her fur coat to her maid, putting her in the lifeboat. She then sat down on a deck chair next to her husband. "We have lived together for many years," she said. "Where you go, I go." They waited for the end, together. By 2:05 a.m., the last lifeboat, Collapsible D, was launched. The deck was now at a severe angle. The band, led by Wallace Hartley, had moved to the boat deck. They continued to play. Survivors in the boats recalled hearing music drift across the water. Some say the final hymn was nearer, "My God, to Thee." Others remember a waltz called Song d'Automne, or Autumn Dream. At 2:18 a.m., the ship's lights, which had burned so bravely against the dark, blinked once. Then they went out forever. The ship was plunged into total darkness. The immense strain on the hull was too much. The stern, rising high out of the water, put incredible pressure on the ship's midsection. With a sound like tearing metal and thunder, the Titanic broke apart. It split between the third and fourth funnels. The bow section plunged into the depths. The stern section, now vertical, stood against the sky for a moment. Then it too began its final journey to the ocean floor. The warmth was gone. The light was gone. The music was gone. The floating palace, the unsinkable bubble, had burst. It left only the cold, dark, and silent reality of the North Atlantic. The great ship was gone. The waking dream of first class, the Turkish baths, the electric camel, the invincible engine soul of it, had vanished into the 28-degree water. For those in the lifeboats, there was only the cold, the darkness, and a profound, terrible silence, broken only by the sounds of the dying. The bubble had burst. The journey was over. But the story was just beginning. I hope this part of our story has been a peaceful companion. If you're still awake, I'd be grateful if you'd let me know what you found most surreal about these final moments. For now, though, just relax. Let the story settle. There's no need to focus. Just let your mind drift as we reflect on what it all meant. The shutter had passed. The engines had stopped. And in their place, a deep, pervasive, and unnatural silence settled over the North Atlantic. The great ship, which for days had been a source of constant, thrumming vibration, was now still. Inside the opulent bubble of the first class, this stillness was the first true alarm. It was more jarring than any sound. This was the moment the dream began to fracture. It did not happen with a crash or a scream. It began with a polite, soft knock on a polished wood door. Stewards, impeccably dressed, moved through the corridors. They were calm. They were reassuring. Their voices were trained to soothe. "Pardon me, madam," they would say. "The captain requests you put on your life belt, just as a precaution." A precaution. The word itself was a comfort. A piece of soft linen to wrap around a sharp object. For many, woken from a sound sleep in their warm, palatial staterooms, the request was not frightening. It was annoying. It was an absurd interruption. Go outside. To the cold, dark boat deck. It was unthinkable. Some passengers, wrapped in the profound psychological insulation of their wealth, simply refused. They rolled over and went back to sleep, dismissing the order as a drill, or perhaps a mistake. The ship itself was a powerful accomplice in this denial. The lights were blazing, every crystal chandelier casting a brilliant, warm glow. The electric heaters still hummed, pushing back the night's chill. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing felt wrong. save for the silence. But beneath their feet, the universe was tilting. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A slight list to starboard. A gentleman's drink might slide gently on his nightstand. A person walking down the corridor might feel themselves leaning just a little. It felt like a building settling. The order had come from the top. Captain Smith, after a brief, grim inspection with the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, knew the truth. Andrews, the man who knew every rivet and joint of the vessel, had done the calculations. The wound was too great. 5 compartments were breached. She could float with 4. She was doomed. He gave her, perhaps, an hour or 2. So the stewards continued their rounds, their faces betraying nothing. Passengers began to emerge from their rooms, not in a panic, but in a state of confused and bizarre pageantry. They gathered in the magnificent reception room of the grand staircase, the very heart of the ship's luxury. Here, under the great glass dome, was a scene of profound surrealism. Men and women, titans of industry and society, stood about in the strangest mix of attire. There were ladies in their fine silk pajamas and fur coats, the heavy, cumbersome lifebelts tied awkwardly over their expensive outfits. Gentlemen stood in their evening wear, while others were in dressing gowns. The cork-filled belts were stiff and strange, an absurd accessory in such an opulent setting, and so they waited, they chatted, they murmured, they asked each other what was happening, and no one had an answer. To calm them, the stewards began serving coffee and tea. The smell of fresh coffee, a scent of morning and normalcy, now filled the air in the middle of the night, a bizarre detail that only added to the dreamlike quality. This was the bubble holding firm. The psychological armor of the first class was thicker than the steel hull. John Jacob Astor, the fourth, perhaps the richest man on board, was a perfect example of this mindset. When an officer told him to put on his lifebelt, he was said to have quipped, "We are safer here than in that little boat." He was not joking, he believed it. This ship was the pinnacle of human achievement. It was a fortress of steel and light. Those small wooden boats hanging over the side, those asterisk looked like the danger. This deep, ingrained belief in their own security, in the infallibility of their world, was why the deck remained calm for so long. Many women, when told to prepare for the lifeboats, refused to be parted from their husbands. They did not understand the gravity. They could not conceive of a situation where the rules of polite society would be so violently suspended. The order to uncover the lifeboats had been given at 5 minutes past midnight. Yet there was no rush. The crew, too, seemed reluctant to break the spell. They needed to convince the passengers that the danger was real. It was not until 45 minutes past midnight, a full hour after the ship had struck the ice, that the first lifeboat was lowered. Lifeboat number 7, on the starboard side. It had a capacity for 65 people. It was lowered with only 28. The first, fatal hesitation was not one of panic, but of denial. It was a mere nuisance. It was an interruption. And for a precious, fatal hour, the great ship simply sat, blazing with light, as its passengers drank coffee and waited for the precaution to be over. As the passengers milled about in this state of polite confusion, a new sound entered the night. It was music. Wallace Hartley, the ship's bandmaster, had gathered his 8-man orchestra in the first-class lounge. This was not a spontaneous act. It was an act of duty, another function of the ship's luxurious routine. The orchestra's job was to provide an atmosphere, to soothe, to entertain, and so they did. They began to play. It was not a somber or funereal performance. They played the popular music of the day. They played light waltzes and cheerful, upbeat ragtime numbers. The sound of the piano, the strings, and the brass filled the opulent lounge, a deliberate and calculated attempt by the ship's officers to maintain an atmosphere of normalcy. The music was another layer of denial. It was a reassuring voice that said, "See, everything is fine. The band is still playing. How could anything be truly wrong?" And for a time, it worked. The cheerful, slightly tinny music provided a strange, calming counterpoint to the bizarre instructions from the crew. It was a familiar ritual in a world that was slowly but surely coming undone. But as the list to starboard became more pronounced and the task of loading the lifeboats became more urgent, the lounge was no longer the center of activity. The passengers were being urged up to the cold, open boat deck. In fact, Hartley and his men moved to. They carried their instruments from the warm, carpeted lounge out onto the deck near the grand entrance to the staircase. They sat up there, under the stars, in the frigid night air. This is the image that has become so enduring. The 8 musicians, in their formal uniforms, playing their instruments as the great ship slowly sank beneath their feet. The cold air must have been brutal, making it difficult to finger the strings to keep the brass from freezing to their lips. But they played on. Survivors, floating in the lifeboats far away in the darkness, reported hearing the music carry over the water for a long time, well after the last boat had gone. The music was a beacon of surreal calm in the growing, quiet chaos. As the crew wrestled with the lifeboat pulleys and shouted orders, the band played. As the first distressed rockets were fired, a sharp, sudden whoosh and a brilliant white bang high above, the band played. The upbeat ragtime tune became a bizarre soundtrack to the end of the world. There has long been a debate over the final song they played. Legend, and some reports, insist it was the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." It is a powerful, poignant image, a final, collective prayer. Other survivors, however, reported hearing the waltz Autumn. The truth may be that Autumn was the last song they played as a band, a piece of popular, secular music. And perhaps, as the end became truly, undeniably imminent, "Nearer, My God, to Thee" was a final refrain, hummed or played by one or two, a private solace. What matters is that they played. Their act was one of profound courage, or perhaps profound, ingrained duty. They were there to calm the passengers, and they did so until the very end. None of the 8 musicians survived. Their final performance was a tragic, surreal, and heroic act. It was the ultimate adherence to routine, a final, defiant gesture of order against the encroaching chaos of the cold, dark sea. While the band played, the grim task of loading the lifeboats began in earnest. And here, the fatal flaw of the dream, the fatal miscalculation, became clear. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. This was more than was legally required at the time, but the law was based on tonnage, not on passengers. These 20 boats had a combined capacity for 1,178 people. There were over 2,200 souls on board. It was a simple, brutal arithmetic. The ship had enough lifeboats for only about half of its occupants. But in these first confused hours, the problem was not the lack of space. The problem was an asterisk of it. The problem was that passengers, steeped in the belief of the ship's unsinkability, refused to get in. They had to be persuaded, siled, and in some cases, physically forced into the small wooden boats. From the high, brightly lit decks of the Titanic, the ocean looked black, vast, and terrifyingly empty. The small boats looked fragile, like toys. To leave the perceived safety of the massive, solid ship for that dark, open void seemed like madness. This is why lifeboat number 7 left with so many empty seats. This is why the first few boats were lowered half full, a tragic waste of space that would later be counted in lives. The order was given, women and children first. It was a standard of maritime chivalry. But on this night, that simple phrase was interpreted in two critically different ways, on opposite sides of the ship. On the port side, Second Officer Charles Lightler was in charge. He was a man of rigid, unbending principle. When he heard women and children first, he interpreted it as women and children only. He refused to let any men board, even when there was empty space. He waved them back, guarding the boats with a grim, righteous adherence to the rule as he understood it. On the starboard side, First Officer William Murdoch was more pragmatic. He interpreted the order as women and children first, and then men, if there is space. He worked quickly, filling the boats. If there were no more women or children in the immediate vicinity, he allowed men to take the empty seats. This decision, this simple difference in interpretation, would have profound consequences. It was on Murdoch's side, the starboard side, that J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, stepped into a collapsible lifeboat as it was being lowered. He was the man who had, in many ways, willed this ship into existence. His act of survival, of boarding a boat while so many others were left behind, would ruin his reputation. He would be branded a coward for the rest of his life. But the most powerful stories from these moments are not of those who left. They are of those who chose to stay. Margaret Molly Brown, a new money millionairess from Colorado, had to be forcibly thrown into lifeboat number 6. She was arguing, helping others, and refused to go until a crewman picked her up and dropped her over the railing. Then there were Ida and Isidore Strauss. Isidore was the owner of Macy's department store, an elderly and respected man. He was offered a seat in a lifeboat on account of his age, but he refused, stating he would not go before the other men. His wife, Ida, was told to get into the boat. She stepped in, but then, in a moment of final, profound clarity, she stepped back out onto the tilting deck. She went to her husband's side and took his arm. "We have lived together for many years," she said to him. "Where you go, I go." Her maid was put into the boat. Ida gave the young woman her fur coat, saying she would no longer have any use for it. Ida and Isidore Strauss were last seen sitting calmly in a pair of deck chairs, waiting for the end. It was a quiet, heartbreaking final act of devotion. Elsewhere, another titan of industry was making his own preparations. Benjamin Guggenheim, the mining heir, had helped women and children into the boats. When he was satisfied he could do no more, he and his valet, Victor Giglio, returned to their cabins. They removed their cumbersome lifebelts. They changed out of their sweaters. They reappeared, strolling onto the deck, dressed in their finest evening wear, top hats and all. When a steward suggested they should try for a boat, Guggenheim famously replied, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." As the lifeboats pulled away, creaking under the winches, they saw the scene. The deck was now tilting at a noticeable, uncomfortable angle. It was becoming hard to walk, but above them, the ship was still a blaze of light. And high above that, the distress rockets bloomed, one after another, brilliant white stars exploding in the sky, illuminating the surreal, tragic tableau. As the last lifeboats pulled away from the ship, they were rowed clear, many of them still half empty. Those left behind, the roughly 1,500 souls still on the Titanic, were now facing the end. The ship's final moments were not a chaotic panic. For many in the first class, they were a strange, surreal, and quiet acceptance of the inevitable. The dream was ending. The angle of the deck grew steeper. The bow was plunging deeper and deeper into the ocean, and the stern was rising high out of the water, lifting the massive propellers clear. It was becoming a climb, not a walk. Deep inside the ship, the sound was deafening. It was a crashing, tearing, thunderous roar. Everything that was not bolted down broke loose. Pianos, tables, trunks, fine china, and even the massive 29-ton boilers themselves tore free from their mountings and began a catastrophic avalanche down through the ship toward the submerged bow. But on the deck, the most surreal detail remained: the lights. The ship's dynamos, deep in the hull, were still running. The engineers, in an incredible, final act of duty, had stayed at their posts, keeping the power on. The ship was a magnificent, illuminated tower, blazing with light as it pointed itself toward the heavens. The grand staircase, that symbol of opulence and the very heart of the first-class world, met a violent end. As the water rushed in, the immense pressure caused its great glass dome to implode, sending a cascade of water and glass crashing down into the reception room. On the boat deck, Father Thomas Biles, a priest traveling in second class, stood surrounded by a large, kneeling crowd. He was hearing confessions, giving absolution, his voice calm and steady as he prayed with them, Catholics and Protestants alike. John Jacob Astor, having seen his pregnant wife, Madeline, safely into a lifeboat, was last seen on the deck. He had asked if he could join her, citing her delicate condition. He was refused by Second Officer Leitler, who was still strictly enforcing his women and children only rule. Astor, the richest man on board, simply nodded. He stepped back, lit a cigarette, and stood calmly, watching the scene. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, its architect, was seen in the first-class smoking room. He was not trying to save himself. He was standing, lost in thought, staring at a painting above the fireplace. The painting was titled, "The Approach to the New World." He was the creator, witnessing the end of his creation. At 2:18 a.m., the strain on the ship became too much. The stern was now impossibly high. With a groan that was heard miles away, the Titanic broke in two between the third and fourth funnels. The forward funnel weakened, collapsed. It fell into the water, crushing dozens of people who had been swimming there. The forward section of the ship, now severed, plunged into the darkness. The stern section, however, did not sink immediately. Free of the bow's weight, it settled back in the water for a moment, as if taking a breath. Then, as it filled, it rose again, pivoting until it was completely vertical. It stood there for a terrible, brief moment, a 20-story black tower against the stars, its lights finally flickering and dying as the dynamos were flooded. Then, at 2:20 a.m., it began its final, accelerating plunge. It slipped quickly, and with surprising grace, into the Atlantic. The last vestiges of the Gilded Age dream vanished beneath the waves. And then there was a profound, shocking silence. The great roar of the ship was gone. It was replaced, a moment later, by a new sound. It was a sound the survivors in the lifeboats would never, ever forget. It was the sound of over 1,500 people crying out, calling for help in the pitch dark from the center of the 28-degree water. The floating palace, the hermetically sealed bubble of the Gilded Age, had vanished. The dream of invincibility was broken, leaving only the cold, dark reality of the North Atlantic. The story, however, was just beginning. A story that would echo for more than a century. A quiet reminder of a world that believed it was unsinkable. I hope this reflection has been a peaceful companion for you. Rest well. We have spent a great deal of time wandering the gilded halls of the first class. We have walked beneath the glass dome of the grand staircase and sat in the humid warmth of the Turkish baths. We have rested in the cooling room and dined in the French restaurant. It is easy to become lost in that bubble. It is easy to believe that the crystal chandeliers and the silk tapestries were the entirety of the ship, but they were not. The Titanic was a floating city, and like any city, it had different neighborhoods. It had different streets and different lives. And as we drift away from the bubble of the first class, we find ourselves entering these other worlds. They are worlds of quiet respectability and worlds of hopeful dreams. And beyond the ship itself, there are the stories of her sisters, the vessels that came before and after, the echoes of a family of ships that were destined to change history. So let us walk quietly now. Let us leave the orchestra and the palms behind. Let us descend the stairs and see the rest of the story. Our first stop is a world that is often overlooked. It is the world of the second class. In the popular imagination, the Titanic is often divided strictly into the rich and the poor. We see the tycoons in their top hats and the immigrants in their flat caps. But between these two extremes lay a vast and comfortable middle ground. This was the domain of the second-class passenger, and to call it second class is perhaps a disservice. By the standards of 1912, this section of the ship was a marvel of luxury in its own right. In fact, it was widely reported that the second-class accommodation on the Titanic was equal to, if not better, than the first-class accommodation on many other liners of the day. This was not a place of ostentatious display. There were no electric camels or verandas with living ivy. Instead, it was a place of solid comfort and quiet dignity. It was the realm of the professional class. Here you would find university professors and authors. You would find clergymen and tourists. You would find middle-class families returning home from holidays in England. It was a bubble of respectability. It was a place for those who had done well for themselves, but who felt no need to shout about it. The heart of this world was the second-class library. It was located on sea deck, and it was a room of profound tranquility. If you were to walk into it today, you might mistake it for a club in London. The walls were not the light, airy oak of the first class. Instead, they were paneled in rich, dark sycamore. The wood was polished until it gleamed in the soft electric light. Columns of white painted wood supported the ceiling, giving the room a sense of height and airiness. But the furniture was heavy and grounding. There were large chairs upholstered in green Morocco leather. They were the kind of chairs that invited you to sit down and never get up. A fine carpet covered the floor, absorbing the sound of footsteps. The only sound in this room was the turning of pages and the low murmur of conversation. It was a place to read and to think, a place to write letters home on the ship's stationery. Just down the corridor was the second-class smoking room. This was a male preserve, much like its counterpart in first class, but it had a different atmosphere. It was paneled in oak, and the floor was tiled in linoleum with a bold, geometric pattern. It smelled of wax polish and pipe tobacco. It was a cozy, masculine space where men gathered to discuss politics and trade. They sat at small round tables, playing cards and drinking whiskey. It was not the high-stakes bridge of the first-class lounge. It was a friendly game among peers. The passengers here slept in cabins that were surprisingly spacious. They were not the regal suites of the upper decks, but they were far from cramped. A typical cabin might have 2 or 4 berths. They were finished in white enamel, which gave them a clean and sanitary appearance. The beds were comfortable with snowy white linens and thick wool blankets. The sofa in the room could be converted into a bed if needed. There was a wash basin with running water and a wardrobe for clothes. It was a simple, functional space designed for rest. And unlike the older ships where bathrooms were scarce, the Titanic provided ample facilities for her second-class guests. The bathrooms were shared, but they were kept spotlessly clean by the stewards. One of the most surprising features of this section was its own staircase. We always think of the grand staircase in the forward section, but the second class had an elegant entrance of its own. It ran through the aft section of the ship, spanning 7 decks. It did not have the massive glass dome or the intricate wrought iron and bronze balustrades of the first-class stair, but it was wide and handsome. It was made of oak, and the railings were smooth and pleasing to the touch. An elevator served these decks as well. It was a novelty for many passengers. To step into a moving room and be whisked from the dining saloon to the promenade deck was a thoroughly modern experience. The promenade for these passengers was located on the aft end of the boat deck. It was a wide-open space where they could walk and take the sea air. From here they could look out over the wake of the ship. They could watch the white foam churning behind the massive propellers. They could see the horizon stretching out in all directions. It was a separate world, a quiet enclave. They were physically separated from the first class by gates and barriers, but they were also separated by culture. They were the backbone of society. They were the teachers and the engineers and the merchants, and they were content in their comfortable bubble. It is a poignant detail of history that the ship's famous orchestra was technically booked as second-class passengers. The bandmaster Wallace Hartley and his colleagues slept in second-class cabins. They ate in the second-class dining saloon. And while they are famous for playing in the first-class lounge and on the boat deck at the end, they also played here. They played upbeat tunes and popular waltzes in the second-class entrance hall. Their music drifted through the corridors, adding to the atmosphere of civilized leisure. Among the passengers in this section were people whose stories have touched the heart of the world. There was a young family named the Goodwins. They were a family of 8, traveling to a new life in America. The youngest among them was a 19-month-old boy named Sidney Leslie Goodwin. For nearly a century, his body was recovered but unidentified. He was known simply as the unknown child. He was buried in Halifax under a stone that read "Dedicated to the memory of an unknown child." It was only through modern science that his name was returned to him. He represents the families of the second class, the people who were not famous tycoons, but who were loved and cherished by those who knew them. The loss of life in second class was heavy, particularly for the men. The survival rate was 42%. It was much higher than the third class, but tragically lower than the first. It was a devastating blow to the middle class of England and America. So many professionals and fathers were lost, leaving a gap that would be felt for generations. But let us descend further now. Let us go down the stairs, past the comfortable library and the oak paneling. Let us go to the forward and aft ends of the ship. Here we find the largest group of passengers on board. This is the world of the third class. For decades, the term steerage was synonymous with misery. On the older ships of the 19th century, steerage passengers were often treated like cargo. They were crammed into dark, airless holds. They slept on metal bunks with straw mattresses. The food was poor, and the sanitation was non-existent. It was an ordeal to be endured. But the White Star Line had a different vision. They wanted to dominate the immigrant trade, and they knew that comfort was a selling point. And so the third-class accommodations on the Titanic were a revelation. They were unlike anything that had come before. When a passenger stepped into the third-class sections of the Titanic, they were greeted not by darkness, but by light. The walls were paneled in clean, bright pine. The floors were scrubbed wood or tiled. The air was circulated by electric fans. It was simple, yes, but it was fresh, and it was hopeful. The passengers here were not fleeing in despair. They were traveling toward a dream. They came from all over Europe. They were Irish and Swedish. They were Syrian and Italian. They were Armenian and Russian. They carried their lives in battered trunks and tied bundles. But they also carried a profound sense of optimism. The heart of their world was the general room. This was the third-class lounge, located under the poop deck at the stern of the ship. It was a large, open space lined with benches and tables. A bar at one end served drinks. A piano stood against the wall. This room was the social hub of the ship. In the evenings, it was alive with sound. It was here that the famous dancing scene from the films would have taken place. But it was not a chaotic party. It was a community gathering. Someone would bring out a fiddle or an accordion. Someone else would start a song in their native tongue, and soon the room would be filled with music. It was the sound of many cultures mixing together. It was the sound of laughter and the rhythmic stomping of feet on the floorboards. It was a bubble of pure human connection. The dining saloon for the third class was located deep in the ship. It was a long room with rows of sturdy wooden tables. The tables were set with white enamelware, which was durable and clean. The food served here was simple, but it was hearty and plentiful. For many of the passengers, it was better than what they ate at home. They were served 3 meals a day. Breakfast might include oatmeal, porridge, and smoked herring, and fresh bread with marmalade. Dinner was a substantial meal of roast beef or mutton with potatoes and vegetables. Tea was served in the evening with bread and cheese and pickles. The smell of baking bread and savory stew wafted through the corridors. It was the smell of sustenance. The White Star Line took pride in feeding its passengers well. The cabins were small, but they were private. Gone were the open dormitories of the past. Titanic offered cabins for 4 or 6 or 8 people. They were fitted with bunk beds that had real mattresses and pillows. They were provided with clean linens and blankets bearing the White Star logo. There were wash basins in the cabins, and there were even a few bathtubs available for the entire class to share. To a modern traveler, sharing a bathtub with hundreds of people sounds horrifying, but in 1912, for a ticket price of a few pounds, this was a luxury. It was a clean, respectable way to travel. But there were challenges. The third-class sections were located in the extreme ends of the ship. They were at the bow and the stern. These were the noisiest parts of the vessel. At the stern, the vibration of the massive reciprocating engines could be felt through the floor. The rhythmic thumping of the propellers was a constant companion. It was a lullaby for some and a disturbance for others. The sound of the ocean was louder here, too. When the seas were rough, the bow would crash down into the waves, sending a shudder through the steel frames. And then there was the isolation. The third class was separated from the rest of the ship by a complex maze of corridors and stairways. To get from a cabin on G deck up to the open air was a long journey. There were gates and barriers. These were not installed with malice. They were a requirement of American immigration laws. The ship lines were responsible for ensuring that immigrants did not carry disease, and so they were kept separate until they could be processed at Ellis Island. But on the night of the disaster, these barriers became a source of confusion. There was no public address system on the Titanic, no voice from above to tell the people what to do. When the ship struck the iceberg, the third-class passengers were the last to know. They felt the shudder. They heard the grinding noise, but they were far away from the boat deck. They waited for orders that never came. The stewards did their best, but there were too few of them, and so many of these passengers waited in their clean, pine-paneled rooms. They waited in the general room with their bags packed. They waited with their children dressed in their warmest clothes. They waited for a rescue that was agonizingly slow to arrive. The survival rate for third class was heartbreakingly low. Only 24% survived. Entire families were lost. The dream of America ended in the cold Atlantic for so many. But we must remember them, not just for their end, but for their journey. For those few days on the ocean, they lived in a floating city that was cleaner and brighter than anything they had known. They stood on the aft deck and watched the sunset. They played music and they shared food. They were a vital, vibrant part of the ship. The story of the Titanic is a tragedy, but she was not an only child. She was the middle sister in a trio of giants. To fully understand her, we must look at the ships that flanked her existence. We must look at the older sister who survived and the younger sister who never had a chance to live. The first of the class was the RMS Olympic. She was launched in 1910, 2 years before the Titanic. She was the pride of the fleet. When she first sailed into New York Harbor, she was the largest ship in the world. She was painted in the same black and white livery. She had the same 4 buff funnels. To the untrained eye, the Olympic and the Titanic were identical. In fact, many of the photographs we see today that claim to be the Titanic are actually of the Olympic. The Olympic was the lucky one. She was the reliable one. Her career began with promise and fanfare. But when the Titanic sank, the Olympic was thrown into a crisis of confidence. The public was terrified. If the unsinkable ship could sink, was the Olympic safe? The White Star Line acted quickly. The Olympic was withdrawn from service and sent back to the shipyard in Belfast. She underwent a massive refit. Her watertight bulkheads were raised all the way to the bridge deck. A double hull was reinforced, and most visibly, she was equipped with a full complement of lifeboats, enough for every soul on board. She returned to service as a safer, stronger ship. Then came the Great War. In 1915, the Olympic was requisitioned by the British government. She was painted in a dazzling camouflage pattern. Bold, geometric shapes of black and white and blue were painted on her hull to confuse enemy periscopes. She became HMT Olympic, the troop transport. She carried thousands of soldiers across the dangerous waters of the Atlantic. The plush carpets were rolled up. The crystal chandeliers were stored away. The dining saloons became mess halls. She earned a reputation for being tough. In one famous incident, she was targeted by a German U-boat, the U-103. the submarine attempted to torpedo her. But the captain of the Olympic reacted with incredible aggression. He turned the massive liner toward the submarine and ordered full speed ahead. The Olympic struck the submarine, slicing it open with her propeller. It is the only recorded incident in history of a merchant vessel sinking a warship. The soldiers on board cheered. From that moment on, she was known as Old Reliable. After the war, she returned to civilian life. She was refitted again and updated for the modern era. The 1920s were a golden age for ocean travel, and the Olympic was a queen of the seas. She was fashionable and popular. The styles on board changed. The long Edwardian gowns were replaced by the shorter flapper dresses of the Jazz Age. The music in the lounge shifted from waltzes to ragtime and Charleston. Charlie Chaplin traveled on her. So did the Prince of Wales. For 24 years, she crossed the Atlantic. She completed 500 round trips. She carried nearly 500,000 passengers. She did exactly what the Titanic was meant to do. She was a boringly successful ship, and that is the highest compliment a liner can receive. By 1935, however, she was old. The Depression had hit, and newer, faster ships were being built. The Olympic was retired. She was sailed to a breaker's yard in Scotland to be scrapped. It was a sad day for those who loved her, but pieces of her survive. The fittings of her first-class lounge, including the paneling and the fireplace, were purchased at auction. They were installed in the White Swan Hotel in Alnwick, England. You can go there today. You can sit in the room and touch the wood. It is the same wood that was on the Titanic. You can sit in that quiet space and imagine the vibration of the engines and the sound of the sea. The Olympic lives on in these fragments, a ghost of the great sisters. And then there was the third sister, the HMHS Britannic. Her story is one of quiet melancholy. She was built after the Titanic disaster, and she was designed to be the ultimate expression of the class. She was slightly larger than her sisters. She was safer. She had massive crane-like davits that could lower lifeboats even if the ship was listing heavily. She had a double hull that ran up the sides of the ship. She was going to be the most luxurious and the safest ship on the ocean. But history had other plans. The Britannic was launched in 1914, just as the First World War was beginning. She never carried a single paying passenger. She never saw a lady in an evening gown descend her staircase. Instead, she was immediately requisitioned for war service. She was converted into a hospital ship. Her black hull was painted a stark, brilliant white. A massive red cross was painted on her side, interrupted by a long green stripe. She was a vessel of mercy. She was sent to the Mediterranean. Her mission was to bring wounded soldiers home from the disastrous campaign in Gallipoli. The water there was not the icy gray of the North Atlantic. It was the warm, clear turquoise of the Aegean Sea. The sun shone brightly on her white decks. It was a deceptive beauty. The war was raging all around. On the morning of November 21st, 1916, the Britannic was steaming through the Chiayi Channel in Greece. It was a beautiful, calm morning. Breakfast was being served. Suddenly, there was a massive explosion. The ship shuddered violently. She had struck a naval mine laid by a German submarine. The damage was catastrophic. The explosion blew a hole in the forward starboard side. The captain tried to beach the ship on the nearby island of Kea, which was only a few miles away, but the damage was too severe. And there was a tragic flaw. Because the weather was warm, and because it was a hospital ship, the nurses had opened the lower portholes to air out the wards. As the ship tipped forward, these open portholes dipped below the waterline. The water poured in, bypassing the new high bulkheads. The ship began to sink rapidly. It took only 55 minutes for the Britannic to disappear. It was much faster than the Titanic, but the outcome was very different. The water was warm, the land was close, and the ship had ample lifeboats. Of the 1,066 people on board, 1,036 were saved. Only 30 people died, most of them killed, when 2 lifeboats were tragically drawn into the still spinning propellers. It was a disaster, but it was also a triumph of rescue. The Britannic now lies on her side in 400 feet of water. She is perfectly preserved. The water is shallow enough for light to filter down. She looks like a sleeping giant resting on the seabed. She is the largest passenger liner on the ocean floor. Her white paint has faded, but her shape is unmistakable. She is a monument to what might have been, a ship of peace that died in war. The 3 sisters are all gone now. One lived a long and full life, earning the love of thousands. One died in a sudden shock of ice and darkness, becoming a legend. And one died in the warm blue waters of Greece, a forgotten casualty of war. They were the peak of the Gilded Age. They were the physical embodiment of a world that believed in size and progress and luxury. That world is gone now. The Turkish baths and the electric camels, the pine-paneled cabins and the dazzle paint, they have all faded into the pages of history. They are like a strange and distant dream, a dream of a time when the world seemed both larger and smaller than it is today. And now our story is truly at an end. We have walked the decks, we have sat in the chairs, we have smelled the sea air and felt the vibration of the engines. But the ship has sailed on. That bubble of the past has drifted away over the horizon. All that is left is the present. All that is left is the quiet of your room, the comfort of your bed, the soft rhythm of your own breathing. There is nothing left to do now. There are no more facts to learn, no more dates to remember. The history books are closed. The archives are shut. The lights on the promenade deck have been extinguished one by one, leaving only the starlight. It is time to let go of the story. It is time to let go of the day. Thank you for joining me here at the Sleeping Scribe. It has been a privilege to share this journey with you, to walk these halls and explore these lives. Your support, your likes, and your comments make all of this possible. I am grateful for your company in the quiet hours. But for now, your journey is done. The ocean is calm. The night is still. Relax, unwind. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket, and have a wonderful, peaceful night.